Hello and well met. This is Lehman with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to go over character management. This tends to be very similar regardless of which rule set you're in. They might be slightly different in where the utilities are located or the format that they're in, but essentially you're going to be managing an XML file that's generated in Fantasy Grounds, and you can either export or import these depending on what your needs are and your use cases. There are a few exceptions where you can take an XML and put them into an online tool and print the PDF, but it's very limited and they're not always reliable. So most of the action happens within Fantasy Grounds. And for those who like to build characters outside of Fantasy Grounds, such as using D&D Beyond or Heroes Lab, there's really not a good solution for that. They would have to be converted and kept up with the current changes in both the program that you created in, the API for that, and for Fantasy Grounds. So there's two different aspects of maintaining something like that. It's easier to print a PDF. It's much harder to parse a PDF or a character sheet into the Fantasy Grounds format. It's been done before, but it was kind of marginally successful depending on what given day of the week it is. So it was really a difficult task to keep track of those and to keep those up to date for the developers. It was actually quite frustrating if I remember right. But nonetheless, we're going to focus more on the Fantasy Grounds aspects of this. I'm using the latest and greatest version of Fantasy Grounds. So this is version 4.5.10, just released about a week ago in August or less. The rule set that I'm showing here is 5e. That's the one I'm most familiar with, but this would be very similar in Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, or any of the core rule sets. The overview of this is going to be to focus on managing the character data. So we're not talking about leveling up and building characters. We're talking more or less about how to manage the files themselves. Some of the key topics is exporting characters, importing, assigning and claiming characters, which is kind of a crucial step, especially if you're doing a one-shot and you don't have any characters building going on. There is an official Atlassian article online that you can visit to help you with setting up the characters and also, for managing the data and moving the data and that kind of thing. There's also a third-party tool that I'll share that is fairly stable. It only has 3 different rule sets. I think Cyberpunk, D&D, and maybe one other. It doesn't support all the different rule sets. You got to remember that a lot of the extensions and the third-party tools that we have are basically GMs that are running their campaigns for their specific rule set. They weren't necessarily made for everyone in mind initially. They just thought they would share it, and maybe some people would find it useful. Maybe a third of the user base wouldn't. But nonetheless, that's kind of the deal with that. So I want to go into data management. So I don't have any characters built. And the only modules that I have loaded are just a few. I have like the SRD, the battle maps, and I have this effects here in case I need that. And then I have some NPCs on the combat tracker just for looks and for aesthetics and such. So what I'm going to do is go to the character section. This is where the players have access to some of this. So if you open up characters, as you can see right now, I don't have anything selected. I'm not going to build a character, but I'm going to import a character. So down here on the bottom right of this window pane, there are 3 different icons. You can add an item, which is essentially building a character from scratch without using a character wizard or a guide. You can edit the list. So if you already have characters in here, you can go ahead and edit or delete or do what you need to do. And then you have import. So I'm going to click the import button. And this will take a few seconds. It's got to go through your entire library for the specific rule set that you're using and scan which characters you have. Interestingly enough, if you've built a character in a different campaign session, you will be able to pull it up in this session, provided you know the name, the title, and that sort of thing, or you recognize it. So when you build characters in, let's say, the 5e rule set, it's normally accessible through any other campaign through this character selection window. So if you have pre-gens, for example, they will be available in here if you know what to look for. If you've made a character in a different game and you want to import it into this game, you simply have to look up the name of that character, provided that you named it so you can find it. That is an important aspect of managing the data, is to name them aptly so you can find them. Figure out some sort of naming convention. So in my case, I know I have 50 iterations of my Dwarven Cleric Dorig. So I'm going to go ahead and type his name in. I know there's probably 50 gazillion of them. I'm just going to pick one of these and import that in. So I'm going to click on the green plus button. So when I do that, it pulls that into my list of characters available for this session. And then I'm going to do a Leyrin one, which was my first Ranger character. Again, I'm going to do the same type of thing. I'm just going to pull in this character by clicking on the plus button. So depending on how the character was created, the artwork token will remain with it as long as it's in this campaign on your table. If your player has supplied you with a file or they use their own, it may not show up with your character, depending on where the art resides. So if you have portrait art and it's different than someone else's, this might come up blank. So I'm going to go ahead and close the import character window. You go back to characters, and essentially this is the characters that I imported. So now that I've done that, I can access these and get them set and ready to go for my next game. Now, to claim these characters, simply a player will log into your table once they're successful, and if these characters are not claimed yet, they can claim them. However, if someone selects one of these characters, it takes it out of the pool for a while till they're done looking at it, and then they have to right-click on the character and release it when they're done. It's a very important thing to teach your players, especially if you're going to be running a one-shot or like a convention game and you got people joining your table all at once. One guy or one person can claim the entire library of characters. That's one thing I do not care for Fantasy Grounds. I hope they change that someday. But in the interim, if you have a bunch of pre-gens, let's say you got 5 characters up there, one person unknowingly, especially if they're unfamiliar with the platform, can technically claim every single character. And the only reason they would do that is so they can preview what's on the character and then they move on to the next one. Unfortunately, Fantasy Grounds thinks that you're claiming it, and then it goes into your pile of characters, so you can claim more than one character and you can play more than one character. However, in a one-shot situation, and when you're limited on time, that can be rather confusing. You can right-click and you can clear the owner, and that will release the character back into the pool. Or if that player knows what they're doing, they can right-click on the character they don't want, and they can release the character back into the pool of character selection. So that is something that can be a little bit annoying. However, Fantasy Grounds assumes that you're going to be creating characters based on the campaign you're in, but that's not always the case. You might already have characters that you want to use, and in doing that, you might run into that issue where someone has claimed all of your characters or half of them, or maybe 2 or more. So if that happens, you just right-click on a given character and release it. You just say, hey, were you intending on playing that character? If they say no, then you just clear the owner. So in this case, as the GM, I can also right-click and take ownership, and it will tell me who owns it. And this is kind of the same case with the players. You'll know who owns what based off of what this says down here. And also by this window up here, will kind of show which characters have been claimed. So if you have that problem, you just right-click, clear the ownership, and that will release it back for the other players to look at it. Ideally, you'd want just one person at a time to come on and tell you what character they want. Maybe send them a preview, or maybe you can print off the PDF or give them a kind of a summary of the characters you have. That way, when they get onto the table, they already know which character they want. That's not always the case. It's not always feasible. And if you're running a random online game or some sort of like a convention or something like that, you don't really have that luxury. So just be aware of that. And the other thing you can do is export a character, and you can make copies. So making a copy is essentially potentially like making a backup. So for instance, if I wanted, let's say I'm running Dorig, and I'm at 3rd level right now, and the GM says, okay, we're going to level up today, but I'm going to make a copy of your existing character, so when you do level up, it's not going to make it to where you can't go back in case you've made a mistake. A lot of times, especially with drag and drop, you don't have the ability to undo or to fix the character. That's why the character wizard is nicer, because you can do all your changes and previews and such before committing, and then you hit save. But once you hit save, there's really no going back to that. So it's good to have a copy of the character at each level, especially in a long-running campaign. For a one-shot, this probably doesn't matter so much, but when you're actually running a long-term campaign, making a copy of this character before I move on to the next level is ideal. So once everything's in place and you're ready to level up, I would just make a copy of this character, and then I would claim it or just use it as a backup. So I'm going to go ahead and take ownership of it, and then I'll release this one back into the wild, because that's the original one that he's going to level up. This copy is going to be for me to back up and for the player in case you need to go back. So another handy thing with this is if you have a character from levels 1 to 10, you'll have every iteration of that character from levels 1 to 10 with the build process. So you won't have to redo the whole character if you make a mistake or your session gets corrupted or whatever the situation might be. So in order to export this and to save it somewhere, like a thumb drive, or you can even upload it to a cloud drive. So what I usually do is I'll make a folder on my hard drive temporarily, and then I will take and put all those different iterations in a folder along with any notes and potentially the file that I use for the tokens. So I might take and make a new folder. Let's do, I'm going to do a character thing. So I'm going to right click, make a new folder, and I'm going to call this Fantasy Grounds Characters. And this is where I'm going to stage all of my exported saved characters just in case. So I'll say backup XML characters. So I know what this folder is for, and I will use this in the future to keep track of every character, or most of the characters, especially important ones from campaigns. So characters. And then what I'll do is when I export that file, I'll navigate to this folder. So what I'll do is I'll make a new folder, and we'll call this Dorig Dwarven Cleric, just so I have an idea of what it is. And this will help you keep track of different characters in your campaigns, and it will give you backup files. So that's an important aspect of managing your campaign. This is managing the character data. That's the topic here. So what we're going to do is take this character, open it up, and as you can see, the artwork isn't saved with it, but it's going to save the XML. I can reassign the token, but it's not going to save the token to export. You have to manually keep track of that file, make a copy of it, and then if you want to keep it around, you don't want to lose that token, put it in the same folder as your XML file so you know where it is. So this is going to be a backup. So what I'm going to do is label it. Instead of copy, I'm going to say level 3, and maybe I'll put the date on here just so I have some reference. I'm just going to put 8/24. And you don't want to put any hyphens or slashes or anything weird like that. Fantasy Grounds doesn't like that too much. So I'm just going to put it in there like that, so I'll know this 4-digit code is the month and the year. And then that way, when I go to look in that folder, I'll know which XML file is which. And this is just for bookkeeping and for archiving and backup. So now that I have that, this is the new character that I'm going to export. or this is the backup, I'll say. And then so what I'm going to do now is click on edit list, and then I'm going to click on export character. And what will happen is it'll bring up this dialog. Then what I'm going to do is navigate to where I have that folder. So I have it in my Fantasy Grounds Academy folder. Here's my backup characters. Here's the cleric. I'm going to say Dorig. I'm renaming it so I can find it. Dorig level 3. I'll say L3 cleric. And then I'll know kind of what it is so I don't guess what it is every time. So here's that, and I'm going to hit save, and now it's saved. It's backed up. It is part of the campaign, but it's also on a separate directory. And if I just save it like this, it will still remain in Fantasy Grounds, and I'll be able to recall that even if I start a new session. However, if you have to migrate your system or your hard drive goes out or whatever the situation might be, it's nice to have a thumb drive or some kind of storage where you have your main characters. And I also try to opt to, if I have any tokens or portrait art available to me, I will save that in the same folder as well, so I don't need to find it again. Maybe I can re-add it if need be or send it to my players. And that's another thing that you can do with that XML data, is that with that file, you can send that to your player if they want to use it in a different game, just because they're familiar with it, it's already built, maybe they want to try it somewhere else. The only issue I can think of with doing that, if the GM allows third-party or imported characters, they also have to have the books to support them if they plan on leveling up. If it's just a one-shot, no big deal, it'll probably handle it. However, if they try to switch spells or they try to level up their character in a different campaign, and that GM doesn't have that access to that book, or the player doesn't, then it can break the character build slightly and not pull in the changes that need to happen depending on what level you are and depending on the types of changes that occur per level. So that's the only issue I can think of for importing characters from another table that isn't yours, or somebody's made character that they made themselves, is the support for the type of class, race, background, that sort of thing. Usually races and backgrounds and those sort of things are pretty cut and dry at level 1. You don't typically have to worry about those. It's the class features and those abilities that change over the course of the character. Those are the ones that you have to have the support for after level 1. So that depends on the rule set too. Some rule sets work differently. They may not have level progression the same way. So it just kind of depends on what the rules do within Fantasy Grounds and how they're developed to work with Fantasy Grounds and characters. And I have to say that characters are probably the biggest difference between Fantasy Grounds overall. Most everything else is the same. Character creation and how that interfaces with Fantasy Grounds is the main difference in Fantasy Grounds. Most everything else is very similar. Building characters, leveling them up, using the combat tracker with characters varies from rule set to rule set. However, on the GM side of things, with just the data and the campaign stuff, it's pretty similar. If once you learn how to use it as a GM on one rule set, you'll have a pretty good, I'm not saying you'll know everything, but you'll have a pretty good idea of where to look. But when it comes to characters, it's a completely different process on every single rule set. Some rule sets have character wizards. Some character creation is very basic and built in. Some stuff is very manual, drag and drop. If you create any custom content, you can't always take advantage of the character wizard. You'll have to do drag and drop. So there's all kinds of factors that go into character management. And one final word is that character management does make a difference, and learning to build characters is very important in Fantasy Grounds and how to manage them. Once you get that down as a game master and a player, things get a lot smoother and they just start making sense. Things start clicking and it gets a lot easier. So I think it took me, I want to say, a good 3 to 6 months to really get an actual good understanding of that stuff, because you don't always have the practice, the exposure, and then there's different rule sets. So I only give that as my personal experience. It may only take you a month. It may take you a week. But learning how to build them effectively and how to build them correctly and how to customize them when needed is really where a lot of the work is. I'd say it's almost half of what Fantasy Grounds is. So that's a kind of a little side tip. But nonetheless, there are tools that you can use that are outside of Fantasy Grounds that are not directly supported by Fantasy Grounds. This is the Fantasy Grounds PDF generator. So I'm gonna choose a file. So I'm gonna go back to the Doric one that I did earlier, and then I'm going to go to my folder and find the XML data. So this is another reason why it's nice to have the XML. So here's the XML data that I exported about 5 minutes ago. I'm going to go ahead and open it. It gives me a name here. Now I got to select the system. This only selects 5th edition, Dungeon Crawl Classics, and Cyberpunk Red. Just remember, this is not an official Fantasy Grounds Smiteworks tool. This is a fan-made, third-party, community member who makes and maintains this. So this may not be for everyone, but I'm going to click 5th edition. I'm going to click on Convert XML, and there's my PDF. So this is handy if you want to play around a table, or if you want to send these ahead of time so your players have an idea of what characters they're going to be using. And this has been fairly stable for over a year. It could break occasionally depending on how Fantasy Grounds evolves and changes. So you may lose the use of this depending on what's happening with the character sheet and with the 5e rule set and with Fantasy Grounds. So I imagine when the new rule set comes out, the 5e 2024 stuff, this stuff might break a little depending on how they set up the character sheets and all those sort of things. So this may only work for Fantasy Grounds 5e Classic, I guess. I don't know what else to call it. But nonetheless, things like that happen, and they change, and then they break, and then you have to wait for the person to fix it. So that's same thing with extensions or anything else that's third party, is if it's not an official product, you might paint yourself into a corner depending on how much you rely on those tools. So in this case, it works, and I could print this off and send this to my players, or I can, take it with me and go to a face-to-face game and use Fantasy Grounds as my tools for running the game, like with maps and books and stuff, and a dice roller. So these are just some character management things that you might face. And like I said earlier in the game, there used to be a way you can take a PDF and import it and convert it to an XML. On D&D Beyond, but that tool is not really functional. It doesn't work anymore. I know that the author had worked on it a few times, but it seems like when he gets it up and running, it breaks again because something changes on D&D Beyond or something changes in Fantasy Grounds more often than this part of it will change. So it makes it harder to parse that data into usable XML file data. So anyways, that's all I have for today. In the description at the end of the video, I will leave some of the links for this stuff there. And if you are struggling with character management, hopefully this helps you understand it a little bit better. And I did show how to export, how to import, how to make a copy, and you'll be able to manage your campaign successfully, especially if it's a long running one. So anyways, folks, you guys have a wonderful week. Have a good